Good morning to everybody here in the room. Also, good morning to those of you who are watching us online. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre, and it is my great honor to welcome you to the 6th annual Japan Symposium that the Perth USAsia Centre has been honored to do in cooperation with the Japanese Consulate here in Western Australia, as well as with the support of Japan's embassy here in Australia. It is the tradition of the Perth USAsia Centre to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. One of the things we've begun to do in recent years is, in part of our respect to those that are emerging, is for an acknowledgement of country to turn to some of the rising generation. So we've had a number of just outstanding young students that help us understand that our First Nations, our Indigenous community here, our traditional custodians are very much involved in the fabric of this community here at the University of Western Australia, but our community more broadly. Today, we're delighted to have Yukio Chaplin, who's a final year student here at UWA, studying a bachelor's degree in conservation wildlife biology. I'll let him introduce his background a little bit more, but I think his name will give you a sense of why we've asked you to do the welcome or the acknowledgement of country here this time. Yukio's hometown is Broome, and those of you who know much about Western Australian history will know that that's really ground zero for Australia-Japan ties. So without further ado, please welcome Yukio Chaplin to provide us with an acknowledgement of country. Yukio.
Good morning, everyone. So I would like to respectfully acknowledge the past, present, and traditional owners of this land, in which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people. It is a privilege to be standing on Whadjuk country. I would like to acknowledge the contributions of Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians to this country in which we all share together, Australia. So I'd like to share a bit about myself this morning. So my name is Yukio Chaplin. My name means snow, or snow boy. So I'm a Bardi man from the Kimberley. So I come from a small town named Broome, known for its pristine beaches and diverse multicultural community. I'm of Japanese, Aboriginal, and European descent. My grandfather, Mr. Akira Masuda, moved here from Taiji when he was a young man after the war in Japan. He told us about the stories, what it was like growing up in kind of a horrific time with starvation setting in, and the need for men of his town to move overseas to support families. He came with a few friends, one specifically being Hiroshi Hamaguchi. So Mr. Masuda came here to support his family in Taiji by sending money back home to his family, while also having a family here to support. He's now one of the last Japanese pearl divers left in Broome and is the oldest remaining. I can tell you it wasn't an easy life, but it was a rewarding one with many lifelong friends from within the industry. Broome at the time was lucky enough to be Taiji's sister city due to a number of skilled pearl divers coming from the town itself. Up until 2009, the ties were cut, unfortunately. So my heritage is that of being multicultural. It is something that I'm extremely proud of because it shows the country's deep history. More importantly, it shows the history of my family and where we come. We can trace our family back into Japan from Broome, and also into the UK from where my dad is from. Coming from simple beginnings and only being a few generations from my grandfather, I will be the first to graduate university with a tertiary degree in environmental science. I was previously privileged enough to attend a prestigious all-boys school, thanks to the scholarship from Yallourn, which is located over east. I applied for this scholarship when I was 12 years old on my own accord, and as a result, I managed to get a full ride into this prestigious school. The road has been a long one, but I still have another semester to go, and by January next year, I will be the first to graduate, and no thanks to the lessons taught by my family and the stories from my papa. And in order, which he had, If there is a lesson here today, it would be that it doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from. Thank you.
Thank you, Yukio. That was beautiful, and it is a reminder that the conversations we're having here today have their deep roots in our own history, have their roots in Japan's history, but also they're ultimately about the future. They're ultimately about how Japan and Australia work together. As part of this 6th annual Japan Symposium, we have focused over the last 2 weeks on technology cooperation. We've done 4 separate 1-hour seminars looking at Australia-Japan cooperation on technology in the defense sector, on supply chains. We've looked deeply at their cooperation on space and on future energy, all areas that I think are quite apparent probably to everybody. You will all be familiar with the visit we had here in Western Australia last October by the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida. We have actually, we don't, but we should have a plaque on our wall of, from my view, the best ever tweet by a diplomat anywhere in the world. And that was Ambassador Yamagami Shingo right before the visit of Prime Minister Kishida. He said, Perth is the geostrategic nexus of the Indo-Pacific and the economic nexus of Australia-Japan relations, which is, all my staff now have tattoos with that statement on it, which is fantastic. It's really good, right? And from that point on, we've made it very clear that Japan has really led the way, just as it did in history, in terms of building the Australian resources sector, building Western Australia's connectivity from the pearl diving days all the way to iron ore, to LNG, to the future with lithium and critical materials. Japan has played a very important building role for our connectivity, not just with Japan, with the region at large. And I think that makes it very clear. We've told everybody else in the region who would listen that they should follow the example of Prime Minister Kishida, Ambassador Yamagami in Japan, and make sure that their presidents and prime ministers come to Western Australia as well. So we're working on it. We're working that process. We're going to kick off this event with some video remarks by Ambassador Justin Hayhurst. I think many of you will know Justin. He's spoken for us on numerous occasions in the past. Justin is a career senior officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He previously served as the Deputy Secretary of the Geostrategic Group and Australia's senior Quad official. He was the lead drafter of the 2017 Defence White Paper, the one which, again, had a very strong WA perspective. It really ensconced the Indo-Pacific as the framing construct behind the Indo-Pacific, behind Australia's foreign policy. Had terms with the Office of National Assessment, served in embassies, including Beijing, and he's now Australia's ambassador to Japan. Unfortunately, he can't be here with us in person, but we're going to have a bit of a shared experience with those of you who are watching it online. We're going to watch some remarks virtually from Ambassador Hayhurst, after which I'll announce the rest of the program. So to our audiovisual folks, if we can go with the Justin Hayhurst speech right now. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Justin Hayhurst, Australia's Ambassador Designate to Japan. And I thank you very much for inviting me to provide some remarks to the Perth USAsia Centre's Japan Symposium 2023. I really, at the outset, want to acknowledge the work of Gordon Flake and the Centre for all the excellent work you do on Indo-Pacific security and other matters. It's an important job and you do it very well. My only regret today is I can't be with you in person. Some of the things that I will say will be familiar to you. Australia and Japan have a very close partnership, officially called a Special Strategic Partnership, and are working together in a regional and global environment increasingly characterised by sharp strategic competition. There's competition over the balance of power, there's competition over standards, there's competition over technology, there's competition in lots of domains. It's very challenging circumstances. Our region, the Indo-Pacific, is also home to the world's largest military build-up, and both Australia and Japan are responding. North Korea has conducted more than 60 ballistic missile launches in the past year, and it's a depressingly routine feature of our embassy in Tokyo's work to report on the latest violation of UN Security Council resolutions. My early impressions are that Japan itself feels very much on the front lines of strategic competition. It is also, I think, very preoccupied with another major security dilemma, namely the question of energy security, energy security or energy transition will be difficult and consequential, I think, for all economies. But for a country like Japan, which is only 12% self-sufficient in energy, it poses particularly complex challenges. It's also particularly relevant for the relationship between Japan and Australia. Another big theme since I've arrived is very much in the realm of digitalisation and cybersecurity, another obvious domain where our two countries can cooperate together. In the broad, I'll just run through some of the main reasons, evident though they will be to all of you, why greater cooperation between Japan and Australia makes sense. We're both democracies. We have a shared commitment to international rules that underwrite stability, prosperity, and sovereignty. We're both market economies. We believe in transparent international institutions. So we've got an interest not only in how power is distributed in the world, but the rules by which power is tamed, tempered, and utilised. There have been a number of shifts in Japan to respond to the new uncertain environment. A series of very significant announcements late last year around defence and national security policy, with a commitment to increase defence spending by up to 65% over 5 years to reach 2% of GDP, and to build defence capabilities in all domains, including cyber, space, and advanced technologies. To put this into a little bit of context, Japan's Acquisition, Technology and Logistics Agency will have its budget increased by 4.5 times in the coming few years to 38 billion Australian dollars. Australia is itself, as you will well know, also going through major and consequential defence capability lift. So there's a complementarity not only in our policies, but in the way our systems are needing urgently to bring into being and put into practice new systems, new defence capabilities, new defence projects. There's an opportunity there for some collaboration, clearly, on defence technology partnerships. This will, I think, be complemented by an ability for greater training and work together in defence. Australia and Japan have both signed a reciprocal access agreement, signed in January 2022, and it will come into force this year, and it will streamline our ability to work together. Last year in Perth, as you know, Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Kishida also signed a joint declaration on security cooperation. We'll also act to support our increasingly integrated strategic coordination. It will also support interoperability, and it will also support, I think, regional deterrence. More broadly, across the relationship as a whole, the leaders talked about all sorts of ways in which we would cooperate more: defence, intelligence, energy transition, climate change, humanitarian assistance, health security, maritime security. Across all these domains, how we harness and use technology and the standards with which that technology is used will be vital. I think it's fair to say that there's strong appetite in Japan for doing more with Australia, and I detect the same on our part from the Australian end. And how we integrate and embed some of our technology partnerships will be critical to that. I wanted to give a couple of examples that I've come across already. Last week in Tokyo, it was the Defence Security Equipment and Intelligence Expo, and more than 40 Australian companies showcased their products and their capabilities and technologies to work with Japan's newly energised and soon to be very fast growing defence industry. It's a commitment there and an opportunity to bring together our industrial bases, to take cooperation, I think, from research to commercialisation. We have indeed worked together for many years with Japan's defence establishment on science and technology, and we're negotiating a research, development, test and evaluation arrangement on the co-development and production of advanced defence capabilities, broadening our initial research agreement signed in 2015 on marine hydrodynamics to all domains. Energy security, as I mentioned, is another critical element of our partnership and of Japan's broader national interest strategy. At the moment, Australia's energy exports, depending on how you calculate it, power Japan's electricity for 8 out of every 24 hours. That is to say, without Australia, Japan can't achieve energy security. It's a big theme of the partnership. It's a big theme of the leaders' visit, and how the energy transition plays out and how technology is harnessed for renewable, clean and green energy will matter greatly to the prospects of both countries. Not just the health of their bilateral partnership, but their ability to achieve their own energy and energy security objectives. We've also signed a critical minerals partnership to develop secure supply chains and explore investment and co-financing opportunities. We can draw on our respective strengths. Australia's a resources powerhouse. Japan has the technology, the capital, and indeed the demand to make viable markets, we hope, and to support joint research and development, including in the battery supply chain. Prime Minister Kishida visited a nickel refinery in Kwinana when he was in Perth last year. Japan's also announced a $200 million investment in Australian company Lynas for its rare earths production. That is an example of the sorts of ways the partnership will work together. We're also big partners in the Quad context, and we're working in that context to harness emerging and critical technologies for the region. We're shaping technology standards, supporting 5G deployment and diversification, bolstering supply chain security. The 2023 Quad Leaders Summit, to be hosted by Australia later this year, will deepen this work. There are lots of other examples. Japanese chip manufacturer Megachips invested $100 million in Morse Micro, Australia's largest semiconductor maker. This investment will boost our company's R&D capability and strengthen its capacity to manufacture and distribute energy-efficient, long-range chips to Japan. In Japan, they're at an earlier stage, I think, of digitalising government services, banking services, and a whole range of other sectors where there's great potential for Australia to be a partner. And we ourselves are massively upgrading our cybersecurity capability, another area we can work together. To really cooperate in this domain, we've obviously got to trust each other's systems, and I think information security is an important issue the two countries will work on in the future. As Japan seeks to expand its own system and protections on information security, we will be there with Japan, sharing our experiences, looking at how we can integrate our systems more to enable greater information sharing with a trusted strategic partner. The end point here, I think, is a bilateral partnership where we don't just work with each other, we work together, we integrate, we bring our systems together. This is pretty ambitious, it won't be easy, but I think there's a strategic imperative for both countries to pursue this agenda. So the two governments have a serious commitment to enhance our cooperation. We have the complementarity, strategic trust, and shared objectives for the international order to make that a priority. Your discussion today is not just relevant, it will be massively useful for governments looking to give effect to and achieve the potential of a partnership that has been elevated in recent years and that culminated, at least to this stage, with the signing of the Joint Security Declaration last year. I really look forward to hearing the outcome of your deliberations. It will be of big assistance to me in my role as we work together to deepen this partnership, not just for bilateral interests, but because an effective Australia-Japan partnership in all domains, including harnessing and using technology, is critical to our wider regional interests. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Hayhurst. I think one of the reasons that he was asked to be the chief drafter of our foreign policy white paper 2017 was evidence today. He's highly substantive. The speech he just gave and the details he put in there give you an indication of how deep the Australia-Japan relationship has become and the direction he's going, the direction that relationship is going. I love that part of his conclusion, that we don't just work with each other, we work together, we integrate, we bring systems together. That really was the substance of the 2 weeks of seminars we had leading up to the symposium today, where Australia and Japan, indeed, whether it's defense or energy or supply chains or space, we're working together, we're integrating, we're bringing systems together. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that today. I would also note that it's quite remarkable to see those beautiful cherry blossoms in the back there. Over social media over the last week, I've seen numerous friends of the center. Minister Kono Taro, who spoke to us last year, was visiting the Japanese embassy because apparently the cherry blossoms have bloomed early in the Japanese embassy's backyard, and they have a beautiful garden. So there's a lot of Japanese political leaders in Richard Court's old house, hanging out there, taking pictures of the cherry blossoms there. I gave some thought about it. This is, we don't have the same cherry blossoms. We're at the start of autumn here in Western Australia, but the beginning of autumn in Western Australia is when our Banksia trees bloom. Yeah, I've been here, this is my 10th year, and I'm starting to get into the cycle of things where, in March, the Banksias are going to big, beautiful candlelight flowers. And so we need to make sure that we've got some up here on the stage next year on this time to ensure that we can have our version of the cherry blossoms going forward. Our next speaker has really been the highlight of the last 3 years of this Japan Symposium. I think all of you are familiar with and know well Ambassador Yamagami Shingo, Japan's ambassador to Australia since December of 2020. He has spoken at this occasion twice before that, and also was here again with the Prime Minister, and has made it a habit of visiting Western Australia. I think they were in Karratha yesterday, and so covered a lot more of the state than many West Australians have in that regard. Ambassador Yamagami Shingo is again one of Japan's most distinguished diplomats and public thinkers. He joined the Foreign Service in Japan in 1984, has postings throughout the world, the United States, New York, Hong Kong, Geneva, London. He previously also served as Director General of the Japan Institute for International Affairs. And so for those of us in the think tank community, I'm looking at Mike Green, who's the CEO of the United States Studies Center, it's always been good to have a think tanker as an ambassador because he speaks our language. And obviously, I think there are probably many in the media that feel the same way, because I can't think of a diplomat, at least in my lifetime, that has had a bigger splash in terms of shaping public opinion, shaping public policy, particularly when it comes to the Indo-Pacific and relations with Japan, and has been more omnipresent on the media than Ambassador Yamagami Shingo. He has this amazing newsletter, Under the Southern Cross, which has alerted now, I think, there are now thousands of Japanese who realize that Australians really aren't that worried about spiders and snakes. We're really worried about magpies. He's got an ongoing series about that. He's helped build real cultural awareness in Japan about Australia. So we're really honored to have Ambassador Yamagami Shingo share his views with the symposium before we return to a panel. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Yamagami Shingo.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction, Gordon. Mr. Kim Beasley, the Honorable Richard Court, Professor Gordon Flake, Dr. Mike Green, Dr. Lin Kwok, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Gordon. I try my very best to live up to what you just said. I should commence my remarks by first thanking the Perth USAsia Centre for the opportunity to address you all this morning here in the lovely campus of the University of Western Australia. It is indeed a great pleasure to once more be out in the West, despite the state emblem featuring a black swan. It comes as no surprise to me to be so warmly welcomed by you all. This is actually my second trip to Perth in the space of only 3 months. What is that saying about distance and hearts? In January, Kaoru and I traveled here on the Indian Pacific, one of the world's great railway journeys and a fantastic way to see Australia in all of its glory. It only occurred to me afterwards that perhaps I could have strapped a GoPro to the front of the train and filmed a new SBS series titled Shingo's Slow TV. This visit marks the 6th time that I have been out to the West since taking up my ambassadorial duties. I've been up as far as Broome, where in one of my toughest missions, I successfully managed to dissuade Kaoru from clearing out the jewelry boutiques of their pearl supplies. Without doubt, WA is a state whose grand ambitions match its size. It is no exaggeration on my part to say that you transcend the conventional to create the remarkable. The Shire of Sandstone is 32,000 square kilometers with a total population of 109. The Kimberley region is 12% larger than the entire landmass of Japan. You are also a very literal state. Bridgetown is exactly as advertised. The Great Sandy Desert is all of those things. Useless loop seems a bit harsh, however. We are in a city with the most self-made millionaires per capita, in a state blessed with mineral and agriculture wealth from one end to the other, attracting all those with the resourcefulness and tenacity of a Gibson Desert emu. Just take a look at Richard, for example. He's a human dynamo, made by his use of a Panasonic e-bike. Great taste. WA and Perth in particular capture the world's attention. You got it from John Glenn, and you've certainly got it from All Nippon Airways, who will commence flights from Perth to Narita from November this year, thereby bringing WA and Japan closer together once again. What WA presents is a perfect symbiosis of enterprise and ingenuity. And that doesn't only apply to Richard and his e-bike. In other words, WA puts the wa in successful partnerships. As yes, WA industry is free to use that one, if it likes. This fact alone was recognized by Japanese businesses over 60 years ago. And since then, investment from Japan has poured into helping to develop the state and its infrastructure and provide Japan with the mineral and energy supplies to match its needs. This cooperation has come to define the Japan-Australia relationship, a relationship that has never been better. It has also provided a firm foundation to move ahead. This is why I have always made time for my friends from WA, as Gordon can well attest. From Gina Reinhardt through to Melanie Brock, my door is always open to WA to share a good Yanchep beef and Margaret River wine and discuss our mutual relationship. That brings me to the crux of my remarks today. How Japan and Australia are combining our strengths to create a secure future. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a given that we are living through one of the most contested times in recent history. Russia's egregious invasion of Ukraine provides a sobering lesson about the importance of preserving the rule of law against powers that seek to overthrow or undermine it. Our own region, the Indo-Pacific, is now the powerhouse of the world economy, providing much of the material and human ingenuity necessary to further civilization as we know it. At the same time, it is a region where challenges to the rules-based order have threatened stability and raised old shibboleth that many have thought dead and buried. That point was emphasized by Prime Minister Kishida in his Shangri-La speech last year, when he warned that the Ukraine of today might become East Asia of tomorrow. This region is also prone to some of the worst effects of climate change. I did want to take this opportunity to send my thoughts to those in the Kimberley still recovering from the January floods. I know they have been through a lot, and it's only March. It was in recognition of the challenging circumstances of our times that Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Albanese met here in Perth just over 6 months ago and signed the updated Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation. Much like Eliza down at Crawley Edge Boatshed, the changing state of the region demanded a change of focus. To that end, Japan and Australia made the historic step of agreeing to consult on contingencies that might affect our strategic interest and sovereignty, making allies in all but name. When it comes to securing critical minerals and energy supply, particularly future energy supply, we are already ahead of the curve. The McGowan government signed an MOU with JOGMEC last December, and also with the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, in January, to promote the development of emerging industries here in WA, particularly those related to hydrogen, ammonia, low emission technology, and decarbonization. Financing for the future, to give it catchy tagline. Premier McGowan himself visited Japan earlier this year, where he reiterated the message that hydrogen and LNG will remain an important part of the energy transition. To go green, you first have to go blue. The Browse LNG project will make a significant contribution to stable supply and energy transition, not only in Japan, but also in other Asian countries undergoing remarkable economic growth. Lynas Rare Earth also signed an agreement last year with JOGMEC and Sword Corporation to increase exploration around the Mount Weld site for new carbonate mineral deposits, itself regarded as a significant development for the global rare earth industry. Australia has also been the testing ground for NEC's quantum computing applications in its cooperation with the Department of Defense, developing technology to optimize the use of autonomous vehicles for resupply missions. This is the first time such technology has been used outside of Japan. The willingness by which Japanese and Australian companies have combined their talents to explore new opportunity in technological innovation and material supply bodes very well for our security future. As WA's own defense industry's strategic plan states, the most exciting opportunities for Western Australia will come through interstate or international partnerships. I believe that sentiment is shared throughout Australia and is certainly driving greater Japanese investment in Australia's tech sectors. On that note, my trip out to the All-Star shipyard at Henderson was all the proof I needed that the prospect for Japanese defense tech cooperation with Australia are very bright indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, unlike Normsville into Mill, it is no mystery as to what has led to the creation of our close strategic partnership of today. It is one word: trust. Trust. Trust is not something given lightly. It relies on deep-seated faith that your interests will be looked after, and that when all is said and done, your mates will have your back for whatever lies ahead. You will have read in the media over recent months Japanese commentaries regarding the coal and gas industry at the state and federal level. These commentaries echoed the concerns of Japanese businesses. Japanese businesses are paying attention to the possible impact that these developments could have on the investment environment area, as well as on the reliability of resource and energy supply from Australia to Japan. When I say Japanese businesses, I am not talking just about those operating here. I am told that the boardrooms of their headquarters in Japan are increasingly paying attention to the situation in Australia, hoping that this will not extend to sovereign risk. The question boils down to the robustness of mutual trust. Let me touch upon another issue related to mutual trust. I want to talk about what some people call the narrowing of the language space in Australia. Living in democracies such as Australia and Japan, whose diplomacy must be conducted with strong public support, the importance of engaging in public diplomacy cannot be emphasized enough. Public support founded on candid communication is what makes mutual trust stronger. In other words, this is what forms the bonds of our partnership. Ambassadors ought not to shy away from requests for media interviews or public speeches in order to share their country's perspectives on important issues of mutual aid. This could also include the conveying of industry voices, given Japan's long-running close economic bonds with Australia, as I mentioned before. Nevertheless, as you may know, there have been a few, yet somewhat loud and unfairly critical commentaries regarding the public relations of the embassy and myself. Many others have been quick to point out that the narrowing of the language space is not in the interest of our partnership, a view with which I happen to agree. This inclination towards self-censorship also has some resonance with what my good friend and aficionado of Hibiki Whiskey, the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, recently stated regarding the pressure that has felt in carrying out his duties, cracking down on foreign interference and espionage. Mutual trust that has underpinned our partnership for decades cannot be maintained through reticence. I am convinced that our two countries' partnership will go from strength to strength through effective and robust communication, public diplomacy, and intellectual exchange. In this task, the role of think tankers will be crucial. I am especially grateful for the key role that Perth USAsia Centre has played in forging candid conversations between experts and policymakers of Japan, Australia, and the United States, along with other like-minded countries, including India. So a big arigato to you, Gordon. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we have taken the steps that have led to our special strategic partnership. Its groundbreaking nature has set the standard for what other defense relationships may come as we tackle the challenges before us. Whatever the future may hold, the Japan-Australia relationship, whether it be in technical, industrial, digital, or logistical cooperation, will go a long way to ensuring that our security remains, in the immortal words of Dennis Cometti, centimeter perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I ask the panelists to please join me up on the stairs here? And someone's going to know how to turn on these lights as well as we go forward. As we prepare for this transition to the panel discussion, let me acknowledge that we have in the room with us here today the chairman of our board of directors, Kim Beazley. You all know him as our former governor, former ambassador to the United States, former leader of the opposition, and former defense minister. We're honored to have him there. I see that we have former Minister David Johnson here as well, Sam Walsh, so many people here. But today, and I'm going to transition to this, if I get the microphone working seamlessly. Thank you, Pat, for appreciating that. As we thought about putting together a panel to have a conversation like this, we didn't have to look far. The Perth USAsia Centre, we're now entering into we're in our 10th year, approaching the actual 10th anniversary of our creation. And one of the real secrets to our success as an institution has been a remarkably strong and engaged board of directors. Recently, Kim Beazley has taken over as chairman of our board of directors. We've had some transitions. Many of you know Stephen Smith, who is a perennial at these meetings, is now representing us in London. And that provided us an opportunity to refresh the board and bring on some real substantive expertise in the community itself. And so today we've got 4 panelists, in addition to the ambassador, who all are members of the Perth USAsia Centre Board of Directors, and each of who bring different perspectives and expertise that will edify our conversation today, but also which edify the work of the Centre going forward in a whole range of other issues. So if I can just very briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn to them in order to kind of make short, kind of 5-minute remarks with kind of a lead question that I'll give to them. First, immediately to the ambassador's left is Dr. Lynn Kwok. I think Lynn is known to many of you. She spoke previously here at one of our Indo-Pacific Defense Conferences. Lynn is the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the Institute for International and Strategic Studies, IISS, based in Singapore. I think you all know the Shangri-La Dialogue is a preeminent security dialogue in our region. I was actually with Lynn in India just a couple of weeks ago at the Raishina Dialogue. I think just before that, she was in Munich. She's been a visiting fellow at more places than I can imagine, and also has served as a visiting professor at Georgetown University. So we're delighted to have Lynn on our board, delighted to have her here in Perth with us today and sharing her perspectives. Next, at the end there, Dr. Mike Green. Mike has been out here before as well. He spoke at our August Indian Ocean Defense and Security Conference. Dr. Michael Green is the CEO of our sister center, the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. He has been in Australia since last June in his current position. Mike was a senior vice president for Asia at the preeminent foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C., the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as being a professor at Georgetown University and having previously served in the White House as a senior director for Asia on the National Security Council. So really, at least by my count, you might dissuade me of this, but I went back in the 25 years I spent in Washington, D.C. Mike is probably the most senior Japan specialist ever in the United States government. There are obviously senior officials from the president on down who work on Japan, but they aren't Japan specialists in that. And so bringing that level of expertise here to Australia is a tremendous boon to this relationship as well. And then next, immediately to Mike's right, is Rebecca Tompkinson. Rebecca, I think you know, is the CEO of the Chamber of Minerals and Energy here in Western Australia. She brings to that role her experience, just a relatively recent position as the CEO of the Royal Flying Doctor Services. And so I think probably the only person that's seen more of Western Australia is probably Yamagami Shingo. But she went by plane, small plane, not by train in terms of that process. But I think you know well, our relationship is really built on a tremendous foundation on the resources sector. I recall just a few months ago joining a celebration between Rio Tinto and Mitsui on the 50th anniversary of the Oak River Project. 50 years is a long period of time. Obviously, Sam has been involved deeply in that process as well. And so we're honored to have Rebecca bring that perspective to our board and to our conversation today. And then last and certainly not least, Richard Court, the Honorable Richard Court, our former premier here in Western Australia, formerly Australia's ambassador to Japan. Richard has been honored on both sides of this relationship. He received the Order of the Companion of the Order of Australia, and the Japanese Emperor awarded him with the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star for his contributions relationship. So you can see why I, as a member of the Perth USAsia Centre team, I'm so excited to have them here on this panel and to have them as members of our board of directors. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to have the four members of our board just kind of very briefly give 5 minutes of kind of opening comments to kind of set the framework for their perspective on our topic today of Australia, Japan relations. And Lynn, we're going to start with you. Obviously, you see Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific quite clearly from your perch in Singapore. So I might turn it over to you for your initial remarks.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Gordon. I thank you very much for the invitation to be here today to sit on the board as well. It's a true honor. It's my second time in Perth, and I am sorry.
There you go.
Let me just start by thanking the Perth USAsia Centre, particularly Professor Gordon Flake, for the invitation to be here today and to sit on the board, which is a true honour. It's my second time in Perth, and I'm really delighted to be back here. I very much appreciated the comments this morning by Ambassador Hayhurst and also Ambassador Yamagami. I also delighted in the student presenters' remarks earlier. One of the lovely things about my job is that I often get to listen to students in my line of work. But this is the first time that I've actually had a student speak so publicly. So I hope that your story will continue to inspire many to come. Thank you. I've been asked by Gordon to speak about Japan and the Indo-Pacific. And so I guess this will set the geopolitical context within which technology partnerships, which is the subject of today's conference, will take place. And I'll focus on Southeast Asia in particular, as that lies at the geographical heart of the Indo-Pacific. And it's also, of course, the region that I know best. Now, the roots of the Indo-Pacific strategies of many countries today lie in the late former Prime Minister Abe's speech to the Indian Parliament in 2007. This was when he talked about a broader Asia taking shape at the confluence of the two seas of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And of course, the significance of this Indo-Pacific concept, as many of you know by now, is that it highlights the importance of the maritime in the region, as well as it introduces or it underscores the importance of India as a strategic actor in the region. And of course, this has certain counterbalancing role vis-a-vis China as well. Now, when the US started pushing out its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy under the Trump administration about a decade after Prime Minister Abe's speech to the Indian Parliament, Japan was the first to move very quickly to outline its vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and thus generated wind and momentum behind the US sails. And now, while some countries criticize the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy for being too focused on the security domain, too militaristic, Japan was able to address a great need in the region for economic engagement. And so one of the three pillars of Abe's free and open, Prime Minister Abe's free and open Indo-Pacific vision was economic prosperity, something that was very much welcome in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in Southeast Asia. And Tokyo has worked very hard since to push this vision. On trade, Japan stepped in to rescue the TPP, now the CPTPP, when the US withdrew. It has also sought to ensure full implementation of the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and finally, so now working hard to put meat on the bones of the US Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And in terms of infrastructure, I think we have the latest Fitch data still showing that although we hear a lot about China's Belt and Road Initiative, Japan surpasses China in terms of investment in infrastructure in Southeast Asia. So Japan is really playing an important role in terms of ensuring that economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia, it's not just on the security front, but it's multi-dimensional and includes economic engagement as well. Now, Japan's efforts in Southeast Asia are very much appreciated and acknowledged. In a recent Southeast Asian Studies poll that was published in January this year, Japan was Southeast Asia's second choice after the EU or European countries in terms of their pick for hedging against the uncertainties of US-China rivalry. So about 30% of respondents picked Japan in terms of the most important player or second most important player to hedge against US-China competition. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of Japan-Southeast Asian, or Japan-ASEAN ties. And of course, you know, the relationship has grown from strength to strength very much through efforts of Japan. However, the operating environment in Southeast Asia has become, or in the Indo-Pacific more generally, has become increasingly complicated. In Southeast Asia, countries openly express how they are anxious about intensifying great power competition. Now, in the past, this used also to be code for concerns about China's unlawful and coercive actions in the region. But increasingly, and I would say in the last few years, when they talk about their concerns about intensifying US-China competition, Southeast Asia is also actually expressing deep anxiety about US action and rhetoric that they consider to be increasingly unnecessary and confrontational as well. And so if we look at Singapore Prime Minister Lee's speech at the 2019 Shangri-La Dialogue, which the ambassador mentioned earlier, he actually talked about how if we were just looking at issues or disputes on trade, on technology even, you know, this would not be as difficult to resolve because you can confine these issues, limit these issues, and try to start resolving them. However, once you talk about deep underlying structural issues, ideological factors, that sort of dispute becomes much harder to resolve, and that seeps into all other disputes as well. So what is Japan's role in this increasingly contested environment? I think Japan has an important role to play in moderating some of the more extreme impulses that might not be coming out from the US administration per se, but more extreme impulses that might be emerging from Washington. I think we've seen Japan's national security strategy recently issued eschew the language of autocracies versus democracies in framing the problems that we faced at the moment. And I think that's a positive sign. And in talking about the problem of China, it focused on the problem of China's behavior rather than the problem of China's system of governance, I think, which would not have been particularly helpful. So I think the national security strategy of Japan has struck all the right notes. And I think Japan has also demonstrated what a more nuanced approach towards China might look like. And as Mike Green wrote for the Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment, which is a dossier that the IISS publishes each year on the occasion of the Shangri-La Dialogue, in which I co-edit. He wrote a chapter last year, an excellent chapter actually, stating that Tokyo needs to deter Chinese aggression, whilst also recognizing a degree of economic interdependence. And I think this sort of nuanced approach towards China is something that need thought about more carefully. We can't be all out confrontational against China without recognizing there is economic interdependence, and there are transnational issues like climate change, etc., that need to be addressed collectively. Of course, taking a more moderate approach towards countries like China and its behavior should not mean allowing the rule of law to be walked over and to be trodden on. In this respect, I think Japan also plays an important role and has played an important role in seeking to sway Southeast Asian countries to take a principled stance, whether in respect of Chinese actions in the South China Sea or East China Sea, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, on the basis that where international law is undermined in one part of the world, it's undermined everywhere. And I think Prime Minister Kishida's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, drawing parallels between what's happening in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what might happen in East Asia if we don't stand up for the rules-based order or the rule of law, that was very much a welcome comment. So I stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You've clearly made the point that much of the Australia-Japan cooperation does have its focus in our near region, in the Indo-Pacific, and to have those perspectives shared with us really helps augment that. Mike, I'm going to go to you next. Obviously, the Australia-Japan relations don't take place in a vacuum. I think yours might work. We'll check and see if it doesn't work or not. But obviously, before the Quad, there's an ongoing, very robust trilateral relationship between the U.S., Japan, and Australia. Welcome your insights.
Thank you. Am I on? Good. I want to thank you all for joining the Board of Directors for our KPI discussion with Professor, or is that tomorrow? Oh, sorry, that's at the board meeting tomorrow. We'll do your KPIs tomorrow. KPIs are excellent, Gordon. Very impressed. Let me just in a few minutes say something about the agency that Australia has because of Japan. I don't think people think about it that way, and I'm sort of reflecting on many decades in government and think tanks in Washington and a lot of time in Japan, and I don't hear about it so much in Australia since I've been here. I think Australia has enormous agency, ability to shape the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific and to shape decisions in Washington when combining with Japan. And it began with APEC. I know former Prime Minister Paul Keating is claiming that he single-handedly invented APEC, but the fact is it was a Japan-Australia partnership on the economic side, probably the most significant multilateral development in post-war history in this region after the initial establishment of bilateral U.S. alliances, and that was a Japan-Australia venture. I entered the White House in 2001, and that was about the time that the Australia-Japan relationship began really moving into the security and geopolitical domain. And I had a bit of a front row seat because Ashton Calvert, who was Secretary of Foreign Affairs, an outstanding human being, sadly passed away, an outstanding Japan hand, proposed to Rich Armitage's American counterpart, and I think it was Takahashi-san, his Japanese counterpart, a trilateral strategic dialogue, which had never happened before, beyond just the APEC economic agenda. I was in the first meetings. It was very clear to me that, very clear. One was Australia and Japan had not had this level of geopolitical discussions yet. And one indication for me was I sat next to my Japanese counterpart who was taking notes. And as Secretary Calvert was talking about a range of issues, including North Korean nuclear proliferation. He was talking about the IAEA resolutions that were being debated. My Japanese counterpart wrote in his notes, I, question mark. He was just was not familiar with Australian accents, early days. But the other thing that became very evident to us on the US side was that Japan and Australia, speaking with one voice, could have a very profound effect on American thinking. So out of that trilateral process came a renewed American commitment to multilateralism in Asia. After 9/11, the US could easily have stepped away, but President Bush was the only president to attend every APEC summit. And in subsequent iterations with President Obama over the East Asia Summit, President Obama initially did not want to do the East Asia Summit. The Australia-Japan combination was very powerful in shaping American commitment because we trust these two allies more than, frankly, any other. You saw deeper manifestations of this when John Howard and Tony Abbott signed, John Howard and Prime Minister Abe signed a security declaration in 2007. Abe and Abbott did the same. And then, of course, you had the recent joint security declaration between Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Albanese. I study alliances. I read these security treaties. I've negotiated parts of them in government. This is a remarkable joint statement. If you look at it, it uses a lot of the same language of US security treaties with Australia, Japan, Korea. It's not a treaty, but it uses very similar language to set up, if not the same level of expectations, certainly a much higher expectation of joint coordination and preparation for contingencies, not just shaping the environment in peacetime through APEC, through dialogue about multilateralism and regional order, but really getting ready to step into the breach in a crisis and find solutions and peaceful solutions should they be necessary. And I think we'll talk about it later, but you look at AUKUS Pillar 2, what we heard earlier from Ambassador Yamagami and Ambassador Hayhurst on hydrogen energy, really enormous upside for Japan and Australia to not only build bilateral cooperation, but really shape norms and order and cooperation in the region. We did a survey at the US Studies Center late last year of the American, Australian, and Japanese publics, very, very closely aligned on what they thought about technology, climate change, energy, security, very closely aligned. The one thing that really stood out to me, though, was we asked the Australian public, would a security treaty with Japan, like Australia has with the US, would a security treaty with Japan make Australia safer? And over 70% of Australians said yes. To which Hayashi-san, the foreign minister, who I saw subsequently said, what do the Australians think we're going to do? But it just shows a remarkable level of trust. To end, Gordon, if I were to say, if there's a bit of a choke point in the Japan-Australia relationship that I see, it's not will and it's not trust. It's what I would call the kind of intellectual infrastructure. And coming from Washington, like me, you'd know the number of think tank and industry association and university programs on Japan and the US is just massive. Australia, with the 55th largest population in the world, has the 4th largest number of people studying Japanese. But at the kind of public intellectual discussion, think tanks, universities, I think in both Australia and Japan, there's a lot more needed. And so this conference today is an excellent, excellent example of what could be done.
Well, thank you. When you mentioned about the IAEA, I tried to think of how I'd say that in Australian. So I looked around the room. I tried to think of who has the most broad, thick, kind of Aussie accent. I looked at my former colleague, Jeff Wilson. So afterwards, if you want to linger around, Jeff is going to stand up here and say IAEA 4 times fast. I'm going to take nothing further for us. All right, next we're going to move over to you, Rebecca. We've already referenced clearly the past of the relationship. But you're assuming the reins at the CMEWA took place at a really exciting time. I mean, with Prime Minister Kishida's visit, with the notion that the road to future energy, the road to future materials kind of runs through WA. I wonder if you might kind of apply that prism to the Australia-Japan relationship.
Thank you, Gordon, and it's a great pleasure to be joining everyone here today for a very important dialogue. It's also a bit of a personal moment, and the Ambassador has quite the social media profile, and I have set today that this is our opportunity for me to be trending globally. So no pressure, but if you can step it up with the tweets, that'd be great, because the team has had that goal since I started in October. We're yet to achieve it, and I think this is the moment. I'd also like to share that the Chamber of Minerals and Energy exists to really emphasise the capability, the competitiveness and the contribution that our industry delivers, not just for the great state of WA, but also for our nation as a whole. And what we are doing is we're stewards of a very important concept, the ability to really continue to grow that prosperity and enjoy the lifestyle that we all have. I wanted to pick up very, very quickly on that RFDS reference to also show that that's a stewardship role as well. The Ambassador spoke of trust, and he spoke of being able to be there for a mate when they really need you. And the RFDS quintessentially represents what that mateship is all about. That as Australians, we look after each other by not sending a Band-Aid, but a plane to the most remote parts of our great state. And that shows the level of trust and respect that we hold for each other and all of the people who travel throughout Australia. And I think it really, again, demonstrates how important that level of trust is for us as a community. Today, we have more than $37 billion worth of trade with Japan, and that represents 10% of what the state of WA exports in any one year. The predominant part of that, of course, is through our mineral resources. And to the Robe River example, we started 50 years ago. The Chamber itself, of course, kicked off more than 125 years ago off the back of gold. And to Gordon's opening remarks, we are at the precipice of the next big transition. And that is absolutely all about those new energies and the energy transition, the achievement of net zero by 2050. You can't get to net zero by 2050 without mining in this country. Our Prime Minister shared that himself just recently. And it's so important, the public policy settings that are occurring within our state at both a national and a state level. And I know, Ambassador, you've spoken very passionately about the security, particularly with the LNG environment and the way in which those policy settings may impact our ability as a nation to really bring on board those new rare and critical minerals. Mike Henry shared the other day that we need to have mined twice as much copper, twice as much iron ore, and 4 times as much nickel as we have in the last 30 years to be able to achieve the global energy transition that we are looking for as a nation. Our own state Minister for Resources, the Honourable Bill Johnson, has spoken of the 82% today of energy that is derived globally from a carbon-based fossil fuel. So in order to get to net zero by 2050, we need to be able to decarbonise 82% of our energy sources and grow that energy opportunity, because as we know, energy grows year on year as to what we need. So the opportunity in front of us is enormous. We're also so fabulously privileged as West Australians, which, as a proud West Australian, a country kid who grew up in Karratha, I share a similar story to our student example this morning. It is so important that we really maximise. We have every single part of the battery components that are required to build a battery here in Western Australia. Every single rare and critical mineral is here in our great state. And we have the opportunity, like Robe River did 50 years ago, to really unlock the potential of those new industries. And the relationship with Japan, the technologies, the financing, the future, I loved that line together to really ensure that we are able to deliver that economic and energy security as a nation.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate that very much. We're fortunate, we've got members of our state parliament here. Just as mentioned earlier on, our premier was in Japan and Korea in January. Just this month, we had our minister for mining, Bill Johnson, was there in both Japan and Korea. Richard, we're going to turn to you last. You've had a chance to hear the other panelists. Yeah. You've looked at this both as a premier and as an ambassador there. I wonder what observations you take from there.
Do I need this? No.
No, you're good.
Oh, good.
You're good.
Get rid of it. Look, first of all, I want to say to you, Ambassador, congratulations on being a wonderful representative of your country. You've been incredibly open, Your diplomatic style is Aussie style. It's good. And just on another matter, as we speak, there's hundreds of Japanese school children in Western Australia right now. And the school exchange programs have started again after 3 years. I was in Bunbury yesterday welcoming a large group at Bunbury Senior High School. At Hawke College this week, there's a group. On Friday, I'm going to Leeming Senior High School. And I think these school exchange programs are so important when we look to the future. But the main observation I want to make about the relation between the two countries is to do with energy security. You heard a very blunt message from the ambassador this morning, and it's a message that I've been receiving now for some years, before the Ukraine invasion by Russia, which has really brought to the surface this whole question of energy security in so many countries. And when I look at the Australian scene, about 4 or 5 years ago, the Japanese couldn't work out why we would be short of energy on the east coast of Australia. They could not understand it. You've got everything. You've got the coal, you've got gas, you've got renewable energy, but there's an energy shortage. And quite frankly, it's going to get a lot worse on the east coast. And the Japanese have been watching this very closely. They're also watching, like the announcements yesterday that came out on the energy front. You've got to look 10, 15, 20 years ahead. And we all want to transition across to cleaner fuels, to more renewable energy and the like. But you have to be pragmatic. You have to have good engineering input to work out how it's going to be done to make sure you have got energy as you go through that transition. You see, to build these large-scale renewable plants that we are going to be building, it takes years. It takes years just to get the approvals in place. For those of you that are involved in doing resource projects, you know only too well, even the most benign projects takes years to get the approvals in place. So you've got a long time frame before these things come in. And you see, the Japanese mindset is different to ours in that they have the ability to think longer term when it comes to these government decisions. We tend to look at the 3-4 year election cycle, whereas they have bodies that are able to look much further ahead and work out what is going to be required. And critical minerals is a classic example. I mean, when Lynas was in trouble some years ago with their project, it was the Japanese, JPEC, that sort of bailed them out of that, of the difficulties that they were having, because Japan didn't want to have its dependence on China for those particular minerals. You've got to understand the time that it takes to make these changes, to handle this transition. So I got your message loud and clear this morning, Ambassador. I've been receiving that message from the senior people in these Japanese companies, and we need to ensure that as we do this transition, we are able to continue to be that reliable supplier of energy. I look in Victoria, there seems to be, dispute internally in their government about the hydrogen project that they've been developing. These projects take a long time to bring into fruition. So that was a very important message, Ambassador, that you gave us. In relation to strategic matters, what has taken place in the last few years has been quite critical for the relationship between our two countries. Mike, you're quite right, the defence agreement that's been signed is as close to a treaty as you could get. And as the Ambassador knows, those negotiations were taking place for years and they were in a stalemate situation. Before the Ambassador came here, he knows the stalemate that had occurred. And it was to the credit of the late and much loved Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Morrison They personally got involved and sorted out the last remaining obstacles that were in place. And what is fortunate is that the current Prime Minister Albanese has been prepared to continue with those defence arrangements, the Quad arrangements, and with the Quad arrangements, the Japanese government was very helpful in helping us to build that closer relationship with India. And you don't take these things for granted, but now we've got a Quad relationship which is strengthening. And the recent AUKUS agreement, there's some interesting spin-offs on the AUKUS agreement because virtually overnight we're now prepared to talk about nuclear, and whereas we weren't allowed to discuss it previously. And there is a link between, nuclear-powered submarines and a nuclear power industry. And I think eventually you will find, as Australia has to build up its skill sets to run a nuclear fleet of submarines, they will realise that countries like Japan have incredible experience, some of it bad, but they've learnt from that experience in operating nuclear power plants. And I think you'll find it will be to our benefit if we can also work not just with the US and Europe, but also with Japan, because Japan has got a difficult decision with its energy transition. And it was relying heavily upon nuclear. Before Fukushima, around 30%, they were planning to build it up to 40%. Now that's been a big setback, but you can see they are now starting to look again at nuclear being one of their key solutions to helping them with their carbon emissions. So my general comments, energy security, because of the policy settings that are happening in our country, are causing great concern, not just in some other countries, and we need to be cognizant of that. But on the strategic side of it, it's just wonderful that it's all been heading in such a positive direction.
Thank you, Richard. One of the drawbacks of having a panel made up of members of my board is it turns out I'm a rubbish timekeeper when it's members of my board. But the reality is every presentation was so substantive, and I didn't want to cut anybody off. So we've got about 10 minutes now to kind of wrap things up. I want to first turn to you, Ambassador Yamagami. I know there's several things that you wanted to react to. In your opening remarks, you gave us a clarion call to be actively engaged in public diplomacy, to not be reticent. I say there's two words I would never associate with you. Number one is reticence. And the second thing, even though I would watch Shingo's slow TV, I don't think anybody's ever associated the word slow with you. So I'll turn to you first for some brief reactions to what you've heard, and I want to get at least a couple of questions in this process.
Thank you, Gordon. I was fascinated to hear all the insightful comments by four panelists. Let me limit myself to two particular points. Could I share the magic number with you all? 764942. My wife knows it's not my PIN number. This shows Japan's staggering reliance on Australia. Among Japan's imports, 70% of coal, 60% of iron ore, 40% of gas come from Australia. Among agricultural items, 90% of sugar, 40% of beef, 20% of wheat come from Australia. So 764942. And, in other words, Australia and Japan have grown together and prospered together. That is why I emphasize the importance of maintaining this mutually beneficial relationship based upon deep, long-earned, hard-earned trust. That is my point number one. The other point, which shows Japan's trust in Australia is we are proud to say Japan has the third largest Japanese community in Australia, only following Japanese community in the US and Japanese community in China. Interesting is the number of Japanese residents in this wide brown route recently reached 95,000. It's increasing year after year, and probably in a few years' time, catching up with the number of Japanese residents in China, making Australia the second largest Japanese community outside of Japan. My second point is, I think Justin, my friend, Justin, your ambassador to Tokyo, he was quite right in pointing out Japan stands on the front line of competition. But I would like to remind my Aussie friends, mates, that there is no discussion in Japanese intellectual circle that we are concerned about being drawn or engulfed in this competition between US and China. We are looking at the bigger picture. We are looking at what kind of regional order we would like to establish throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Both Australia and Japan have been on the receiving end of economic coercion. So we would like to establish the regional order where everybody is going to play by the same rule, where no weakling is going to be pushed around, where we will establish equal partnership. That's what we can work together amongst Japanese, Australians, and Americans. That's how we see the situation. Thank you.
Very clear. I'm recognizing that we have the U.S. Consul General here. We have the Consul General from the United Kingdom. Delighted to have the consulate back here, fully staffed. We have the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's ambassador to Western Australia here, and also one of the deputy secretaries of the department here. So we actually almost have an AUKUS grouping at the front tables here. So I wonder if I might just very briefly, because again we're just right at the end, just get kind of a 1 or 2 sentence reaction from what does AUKUS mean for Australia-Japan relations. And we'll start with you, Mike, and then others just kind of, what are the things that you're focusing on, Matt? Because it's been very much in our media for the last 2 weeks. So, Mike.
Well, at a fundamental level, the capability, the deterrence capability that would be delivered by AUKUS, and not in 20 years, but pretty quickly with the rotation of Royal Navy and US Navy submarines to this part of Australia, is good for Japan, and it's good for India, and it's good for Singapore, it's good for maritime nations in Asia. And our polls that I mentioned earlier show a majority of Japanese support AUKUS for that reason. Japan's not going to be in the nuclear submarine business, doesn't need to. When the Royal Australian Navy goes out the front, it's 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers to the choke points or less in some cases. Japan goes out the back door and there's the PLA Navy and the North Koreans. So diesel subs will do, but Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is advanced capabilities, is where, as Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister, has said, that's where Japan can dock in. Because a lot of those advanced capabilities are things Japan's developing as well.
Very good. Rebecca.
It's a great opportunity for us to accelerate the identification and the bringing to market of those rare and critical minerals, which are so essential to a number of the elements within the AUKUS program and the build that's in front of us. Again, I'm going to come back to that financing of the future, that deep partnership that we have demonstrated over more than 50 years together of the ability to leverage the technologies together. We're a great partner because we bring different strengths to the table. And I think AUKUS is an opportunity for us to double down on the bits that we can provide together through the partnerships that we already have with many different Japanese companies.
Sure.
I think I've already made my key comments in that Japan has incredible expertise and experience in nuclear power, and I think it's going to be a part of developing our skill sets as we move into that new era.
Thank you. Lynn?
Well, not so much on what AUKUS means for Japan-Australia relations, but how it's been received in the region. I think ASEAN has no official position or common position on what AUKUS means for ASEAN. However, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia have been rather concerned about AUKUS. Perhaps their recent official comments have been a little more muted than when the announcement was first made in September 2021. Countries like Malaysia and Indonesia worry about, an arms race in the region because of initiatives like AUKUS, as well as the risk of nuclear proliferation. Indonesia, I think we've seen some parliamentarians come out to say that submarines would not be allowed in Indonesian archipelagic waters, which is ridiculous because, first of all, it's against the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and also, Indonesia permits US and Chinese submarines through its waters, so I don't see an issue here. We've had countries like the Philippines take a very positive view of AUKUS, recognizing, of course, that ASEAN doesn't have the capabilities to support peace in the region, which is necessary. And then you've had countries like Singapore and Vietnam who have taken, I suppose, a more I don't know what the word would be for it, but I think they're implicitly approving of the deal if, and these are the caveats, if it promotes peace, as well as if it complements ASEAN centrality. So a divergence of views, but I think this recent announcement or activities around AUKUS was received a little bit more favorably than the last surprise announcement. So thank you.
Thank you. Master Yamagami?
AUKUS, I think Japan was the first country to have publicly stated Japan welcomed the creation of AUKUS. And this is a steadfast position, and we believe AUKUS is very, very instrumental, in terms of, further promoting, deterrence in the region. So we stand ready to extend Japan's, cooperation, possible cooperation, AUKUS, advances from the first round to subsequent, rounds. Of course, the starting point is building of nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. But when it comes to quantum technology, AI, and hypersonic, there are several things Japan can make contribution to our strategic partners and allies. So Japan stands ready.
So you will all have seen that just in the this month alone, Australia has had a flurried pace of diplomacy with our Prime Minister in India, in South Pacific, then of course in San Diego for AUKUS. It's probably only matched by that of Prime Minister Kishida, who had his own visit to India, had a remarkable summit with South Korea, which is very much welcomed, I think, in the region, and then was in Ukraine. And I think that parallel track of diplomacy was echoed in the course of our panel today. I have a long list of questions that were submitted beforehand. I hope to turn to Tim Lester, who's with the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Council. But I'm aware that Shinkansen drivers, will lose their job if they're 2 minutes late, and we're almost right exactly on time. We've got a wonderful audience who's been joining us online. Consul General Naito, one of the lessons we learn as we think about what we might do together with you next year is we probably need a little bit more time. The relationship has grown in terms of size and scope. There's too many issues for us to discuss. But on behalf of the Perth USAsia Centre, our thanks to the Consulate for their support, to you, our community, for joining us today, but particular thanks to our tremendous panelists and Ambassador Yamagami. So please join me in thanking them for their participation today. Let me also acknowledge my wonderful team at the Perth USAsia Centre. They're always They can't control me and my timekeeping skills, but they do a magnificent job on running these events. And this time in particular, let me acknowledge my colleague Gemma King, who has kind of run this entire series this week herself. So thank you to the team at the Perth USAsia Centre. And those of you online, thank you. We look forward to joining you next year and many activities between now and then. Appreciate it.